Okay, so we're ready to start our second panel, and I'm very pleased to have four speakers with us representing four different constituencies and indeed parties, but hopefully they can speak more broadly rather than just narrowly representing a party platform. So I'll introduce them in the order of them speaking. I should also say at the outset, whilst the SDLP, the UUP, the Alliance and Sinn Féin are represented on this panel, the DUP was invited to take part, but either declined to do so or, in any case, is not engaging. But anyway, we're happy to have all other parties represented. So I'll introduce them and then hand over to them. To speak first will be Conor Murphy, who's a Sinn Féin MLA for Newry and Armagh, and he's currently Sinn Féin spokesperson on the economy. He was first elected to the Assembly in 1998, and he's played a leading role within the party's negotiating team, having held a number of ministerial positions within the power-sharing executive since 2007. In the last executive, he served as the finance minister and was at the forefront of the executive's response to the global pandemic and the cost of living crisis. So Conor will go first. Second will be Doug Beattie, who was elected as a UUP MLA for the Upper Bann in 2016 and became the leader of the party in 2021. Before joining politics, he served for 28 years in the British Army, rising to the rank of captain and serving in Northern Ireland, as well as Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan and Iraq. He was awarded the Military Cross in 2006 for his actions in Afghanistan, and is the author of two best-selling books about his military career. Third, Kate Nicholl, who's an Alliance Party MLA for South Belfast, first elected in 2022. She served as the 79th Lord Mayor of Belfast from June 2021 to May 2022, having served on the Belfast City Council since 2016. Her tenure as Lord Mayor saw her focus on assorted policies, but including many on health and well-being for children. Finally, last but not least, Hanna is an SDLP Member of Parliament for South Belfast, elected in December 2019. She's been representing South Belfast since 2011 as Belfast City Councillor, then as an MLA in the Northern Ireland Assembly until her election to Parliament in 2019. In Westminster, Hanna serves as a member on the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee and is the SDLP spokesperson for Europe and International Affairs. So much like last time, each speaker is going to be given 7 minutes. I'm going to have to police that ruthlessly, so I'll get out my mechanism. After that, we'll have a period, again following on from the precedent already set, further to be a panel discussion, reminding the audience again that you will have your say, but at the end of after the last session. So if I could hand over to you, Conor Murphy, first.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I just say at the outset, I am disappointed that the DUP aren't here, because not only is it an opportunity for yourselves as an audience to hear from all of us, but it's also an opportunity for ourselves for a dialogue, which is often sometimes more productive because we're away from the spotlight of politics at home. So I just think it's a missed opportunity for them, but nonetheless, I don't doubt the panel will do a good job in trying to represent our broad perspective on the Good Friday Agreement. I suppose just a perspective on it, and bear in mind everybody came to the Good Friday Agreement from their own perspective and with their own objectives in terms of the negotiation and what they wanted to see or what they could live with in terms of that. I think everyone had a genuine desire to end conflict and create better, peaceful circumstances. But politically, I suppose everyone had their own particular objectives in relation to it. For us, it did create a space it created a new paradigm, and I think for Republicans certainly they felt that that was the first time in the history of the state since partition that there was that opportunity to address causes of conflict. Issues like inequality, the parity of esteem, and the prospect of constitutional change by peaceful means were factors for us that I think were key in terms of gaining support from across our community. We also were very clear that it was not a solution, and I think sometimes when people talk in the present day about the disappointments, and there have been many disappointments since the agreement, but I have to say, if you lived in the period prior to it and grew up in the conflict, you would absolutely understand that we're in an awful lot better place in Ireland than we were pre-1998. But the sense that was that some people considered it to be a solution settlement, the final settlement, but in fact it was to create space to allow a lot of the issues that caused the conflict to be resolved, including the issue of the constitution, which continues to be a disputed position to this day. And in doing that, I think it also left then other, sometimes bigger issues which have yet to be resolved, understandably. It didn't attempt to address in any real way, I suppose, the issue of legacy, the issue of justice. These issues were mentioned, and a process created to try and resolve the problems that were around that. The issue of militarisation, including the militarisation of the state forces, as well as those who were opposed to the state or were considered in older historical terms irregular forces. The issue of weapons and militarisation. All these things were put in a space that was beyond the initial Good Friday Agreement text itself, albeit they were referenced with future processes to resolve them. But I suppose the understanding was that if we could get some of the basic principles of the Good Friday Agreement working correctly, like power sharing, like equality, like parity of esteem, that these would create a space where some of the bigger, thornier issues could be addressed in the time ahead, including the big issue that is still required, even with all of the improvements, the issue of reconciliation. So I think those principles in terms of the Good Friday Agreement, and much work has been done on all of those issues, in effect, albeit with sporadic violence and continued threat, the issues of conflict, the forces of conflict have largely disappeared from the scene. Young people are growing up, as I've said by some of our previous panel, in a very, very different atmosphere from the generation that I was part of, grew up in, and for that we're extremely thankful. But there are the principles that were part of the Good Friday Agreement undoubtedly will continue to be necessary in the time ahead. We have made strides in equality, we have certainly made strides in terms of parity esteem, and we've made strides in terms of creating a better space for dialogue, for constitutional change, but we have still challenges in relation to reconciliation, with huge challenges in relation to legacy as well. So I suppose the experience of that, and I think those principles are very much necessary for whatever the future holds for Ireland. Those principles of trying to create a space to address issues of history, of conflict, of hurt, of different aspirations, of uncertainty around the future, optimism or pessimism, depending on which side of the constitutional debate you come from. All of those issues that need to be addressed in a sensitive and a mature way in the time ahead, I think could well be the principles that were established in the Good Friday Agreement can be the bedrock for that type of dialogue that's necessary ahead. The practice, of course, is that we have suffered from a number of issues over the last 25 years. People very clearly mentioned the stop-start nature of the executive, and that's gone right back to 1998 itself, when it took us a year and a half to get an executive in place, and then it was up and down over a number of times over the subsequent years, and then down for 5 years between 2002 and 2007. Then you've had the most recent interruptions in that. A big issue which, and I listened to some of the, particularly from the community sector, the people who were speaking in the last panel, and quite a lot of the issues which they I think have caused, I suppose, pessimism and a little bit of despair in the current is actually the impact of bad budgets. It's actually the impact of austerity measures. in which sectors of society who need the most help are being left behind because of an approach in terms of austerity over the last 12 years. And you cannot remove the ability to try and invest in communities, to invest in the opportunities for communities, particularly those who have been so much left behind, those who have yet to experience a peace dividend, and then expect people to be optimistic about the future, expect people to think that society is progressing in a way which serves their interests and gives them hope for the future as well. So that impact of I think the austerity policies can't be underestimated. And also that coincides with a particular view on devolution that the Tory party have. And they're not fans of devolution. They're not fans of devolution in Scotland or Wales, and they're certainly not fans of it in the north. And that has characterised their approach, which has been a very much a hands-off approach. And those of us who adhere to the Good Friday Agreement and recognise its absolute importance to the people of Ireland right across the island, and to the people of Britain as well, in terms of the transformation that it has caused in those relationships, and relationships on the island itself, know that it needs constant and ongoing attention from both governments. And that doesn't mean that people need their hands held or that we're not mature enough to do real politics. It just means that this is a process of conflict resolution which needs ongoing attention. And the idea that you can somehow plunge people into poverty in the middle of that and expect that the outcomes that were undertaken in the Good Friday Agreement will be achieved, I think, is a poor outlook on it. There are other big challenges, of course. People have referenced Brexit, and again, I think that goes back to the kind of the Tory attitude to devolution, in that project was undertaken without any regard whatsoever for the painstaking work that had been put into a peace process in Ireland, without any regard to the impact that the idea of yanking us out of the single market and the customs union would have in terms. And I'm a border dweller. I live just a short number of miles from the border, and I know exactly what the position was growing up as a child, right through to how that changed in the advent of the customs union and the single market. And while that wasn't a political arrangement in terms of the island or the constitutional arrangement, it certainly was a significant softening of the border, allied to demilitarisation, which was a very necessary, if later, step in the Good Friday Agreement. Then that transformed the landscape that I grew up in and began my politics in. So I think that the approach to Brexit, the disregard for the developments and the sensitivity and I suppose the fragility of the developments in Ireland in terms of peace, I think was really a serious lack of judgment or lack of concern on behalf of the British government. I think the DUP made a serious mistake in aligning themselves to that, and people in the previous panel have speculated what the purpose of that was, but only for, I think, some very serious efforts from those. And I mean, I know it's the point that Brian made about the people who voted to remain, and the numbers for remain would not have been as high as they were if people from the unionist community had voted, and quite clearly people from the unionist community voted to remain for a variety of reasons. Some of them wished to be part of Europe, some of them recognised the contribution that Europe had made, and some of them also recognised the danger in terms of moving to a situation of a hard border. So, I mean, I think that was acknowledged at the time, and I would acknowledge it here and now, that we recognise that a great many unionists voted to remain, recognising for whatever number of reasons the bad idea that Brexit would be. But it took serious effort, I think, on behalf of the parties in the north who were opposed to Brexit in terms of articulating the case against it and the damage that it could possibly do, but also the Dublin government, Brussels and the United States, to make sure that the Good Friday Agreement became a paramount consideration, because it wasn't a paramount consideration in the British government's approach to Brexit. Another issue which I think again strays...
Could you end with this last? Could you?
Yeah, I'll finish with this. I think that it strays us very far from the principles of the Good Friday Agreement is the legacy bill, which is currently going through the House of Parliament, and I'm sure that will be expanded on further, perhaps by other speakers. But that is a complete repudiation of all of the efforts of all of the parties to try and deal with legacy in a way which contributes to reconciliation. So the future for me is based on the principles of the Good Friday Agreement, whatever the constitutional outcome, but it's also placed on planned and open and sustained dialogue around what our future looks like, based on those principles of protection, of equality, of parity of esteem, of justice and economic justice for people.
Great, thanks so much. Doug.
Thank you, and it's great to be here. I suppose when we think about the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and we have for the last 6 months, we spend an awful lot of time patting ourselves on the back and saying what a fantastic deal it was. And I think that's a fair thing to do in many parts, because the Belfast Good Friday Agreement was a pivotal moment in history in Northern Ireland, and it did take extremely brave men and women to make that leap of faith to bring it about. And I think if you view the Belfast Agreement through the lens of 1998 and what went before, it was absolutely monumental. The main thing, of course, is that it brought the fact is that we stopped killing each other. There are people walking about today, if we hadn't had the Belfast Agreement, would not be walking about today. It also brought forward a democratic means for everybody to campaign for their own aspirations for the future, whether that's for a United Kingdom or whether that's for a United Ireland. And it also brought forward the ability for Northern Ireland politicians to make decisions for the Northern Ireland people. So you can see that there was an awful lot of good things in there, and there was real difficulties as well, major difficulties. And those major difficulties were based around allowing the prisoners out. And that still affects people today, and there's no point dancing around it, because it's easy to forget that in 1998 what we'd gone through and what we had asked people to put up with, particularly the victims. And you know, I've lost my own family member murdered by terrorists, so I understand to a degree what some people were thinking, and we never really dealt with that, and we never really dealt with legacy back then, and haven't now, I have to say, in any meaningful way. But then when you look at 1998 and you start looking at it through a different lens, and that is the lens of today, you suddenly start looking to see, well, what actually happened? Well, it seems that what actually happened was the governments took their foot off the accelerator. They kind of threw their hands in the air and said, 1998, that's it, done. Look what we've achieved. We've finished. That's it. We're gone. And they pulled back. They didn't nurture this peace agreement, this 1998. It was not nirvana, but it was something to be cherished and nurtured with all its failings and frailties. And the UK government and the Irish government simply did not do that, and they allowed people to try and make their own path with those old party political biases getting in the way from all directions, I have to say. And we suddenly started to slip backwards. And then we had that period of direct rule, and even within that period of direct rule, we then moved back into a separated prison regime where we never had before. We got rid of separated prison regime, but in 1992 we allowed it to slip back in again. There was no movement on victims, still no movement for victims, and there was no movement for decommissioning. And if you go into some of those hard-pressed communities, both nationalist communities and loyalist communities, you could see that backslapping of the Belfast Agreement of 1998 and all the benefits they thought they were going to get from that were not materialising. They were not presenting itself in the manner that they had expected them to present themselves. And what then happened over a series of years following that was this attempt by the UK and the Irish government to do anything they possibly could just to get a deal to get Stormont back up and running again, as if the foundations were there and they were perfect. And it started with the St Andrews Agreement, which absolutely corrupted the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And then we had the Fresh Start. Then we had the Stormont House Agreement and the Stormont House Legacy Agreement, which is as bad as the agreement what we have today. And then we had the New Deal, the New Decade, New Approach, which was the old approach of getting two parties to sign up to something and tell everybody that the deal has been done. I remember sitting in Stormont House reading the deal for the first time when the Secretary of State was out the front announcing that the deal had been done. So that was using that old approach of let's just stick a sticking plaster over it, where the real problem was is that there was a dysfunction within the government itself, within the executive itself. That is, mandatory coalition in the manner that it was simply was not working, and it was not being addressed. And it's still not being addressed today, as we have another collapse, and we've had multiple collapses. And then you add on top of all of this Brexit, and we were quite clear as a party before 2016, Brexit was going to be destabilising, not just for Northern Ireland, Brexit was going to be destabilising for the whole of the United Kingdom. It was. The protocol was some form of sticking plaster to try and deal with that destabilising Brexit, and we said it was not going to work, and it did not work. And now we have the Windsor Framework. The Windsor Framework, which was actually agreed nearly a year ago, as I sat with Maros Sefcovic in Brussels in March 2022, when he outlined the whole of the Windsor Framework to me, less being called the Windsor Framework. So it was in place. And the Windsor Framework is more about defence and security cooperation between the UK and the EU and the US than it is dealing with the fundamentals of Northern Ireland. So where we are today, looking at the lens of 2023, it's quite simple. We have no government now. We had an election last May. Sinn Féin was the largest party. Sinn Féin must be allowed to take their position as the largest party in Northern Ireland and have the First Minister. If we do not allow that, we will absolutely undermine democracy in Northern Ireland. Do I like Sinn Féin being the First Minister? Of course I don't. I wanted to be the First Minister. The DUP wanted to be the First Minister. SDLP wanted to be the First Minister, but it was Sinn Féin. And that's what democracy is. And I like the press to test. Let them go in. Let them be the First Minister. Let's see what we can do with Northern Ireland to see if we can make Northern Ireland work. The Windsor Framework is not the starting point that I would have wanted for the future for Northern Ireland. It simply is not. But there are things within it that we can use and grasp to make Northern Ireland a better place. And there's things in it that we need to fight and change. But they can only be done when you're in government. If you're not in government, you simply cannot do it. So from the non-Nirvana of 1998 to where we are now, we've gone through many iterations, and we may be on the very last one today. This might be the last one now, and Stormont may not come up again. That might be the end of it. And what happens next, we don't know. Because I don't think the UK government has a plan B. I don't think the Irish government has a plan B. I don't think the DUP has a plan B. We think that the basis framework of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement can work, but it needs changed. But you cannot change it until we get government up and running. And when we get government up and running, you set a window of 6 months. You say 6 months after getting Stormont up and running, we need to come up with a way of fixing the foundations of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement so no one party can collapse it again. That's what we have to strive for. That's what we're intent on striving for. And in all of this, we have to reach out to those deprived communities who still to this day, 2023, 25 years after the backslapping of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, still have not seen the benefits of it. They haven't seen that social change coming into their communities. And in fact, it's got worse because we've now got a stage where we are demeaning some of our communities. We had a great talk before about what it's like at grassroots levels. And here's what I see sometimes at grassroots levels, to finish up with this. I listen to fantastic poets and musicians who play Irish music. And we call them poets and we call them musicians. But I see people playing in the bands, fantastic musicians playing in the bands. And what do we call them? Bandsmen. Not musicians, bandsmen. Because people try to drop that term down to its lowest common denominator. Of course, they're bandsmen, they play collectively, but they are musicians, and they are playing tunes to deal with their own culture. That's the things that we need to look at, and things that are incredibly important. I'm an optimistic pessimist. I think we can get through this. I think government needs to be up and running now. I think we need to address the issues that we've got in front of us. I'm happy to have a conversation with anybody about a united Ireland, but I'll make it clear. I'm a constitutional unionist. There is no tick box for me. When it gets tough, then I work harder, but I will work for the union and nothing else. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Kate.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Niamh for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here. My stepdad actually came to St. Catharine, so it's really nice to have a wander around my first time in Cambridge. My name is Kate Nicholl. I'm an Alliance Party MLA for South Belfast. I am a little bit older than Emma, but my politics is similar in that my experience of Northern Ireland is very much the after. My dad is from Northern Ireland, my mum is South African, and I was born in Zimbabwe, and I moved to Belfast in 2000. We left Zimbabwe at a fairly difficult time. I think that's why I'm an optimistic optimist. I have experienced a very low bar of democracy, and have always been incredibly grateful that Belfast became my home when I didn't have one anymore. And I love it. It's the most wonderful city, and the opportunities are endless. And it was an enormous honour to be Lord Mayor of Belfast before I was elected to the Assembly. And during that year and during that time, you really see kind of how different it is on the ground and how different it is to politics, you know. The barriers and difficulties that people are facing in communities are all the same. And I think there's a real lack of leadership, and that needs to change. In some of the key points that we were asked to discuss, the first one was around legacy. And for me, the legacy is extraordinary. It's sustained peace. It's people who are still alive today because politicians, leaders had the courage and the bravery to step forward and do something that was different and that was unpopular, but that would benefit the majority. We've seen the increasing democratization, and with that the stability, some stability, and the reformed police and justice and other institutions, and that's incredible. And I think it's very easy to lose sight of the magnitude of what the Good Friday Agreement has achieved, especially when you're looking at it from the context of an assembly which is not functioning. I was elected in May. I was very surprised to be elected. I was heavily pregnant and thought I was getting a year maternity leave. John Tong was the only person who thought I was going to get elected, and then I was. And it's a massive honour, and I love it, and it's the best work you can possibly do, and it's so rewarding, but it's incredibly frustrating being a legislator who can't legislate. And I feel like a little bit of a fraud being here in Cambridge addressing all of you about the Assembly in which I've not actually sat. I have six or seven times when we've tried to elect a speaker. On one of those occasions, 72% of the people of the members in the Assembly voted for Claire's colleague, Patsy McGlone, to be speaker. But because of the cross-community vote requirement, where those who designate as other, it's very offensive to us, by the way, we don't like being described as other. We're not other just because we're not nationalist or unionist. We believe in a united, shared community. The fact that we don't have a speaker, but 71% was consensus enough for the Good Friday Agreement is pretty galling. It's pretty galling to be an MLA and having a constituency office and people coming in who are in desperate need, special educational needs, places, kids who can't get places in school that they need, budgets being cut, children not having access to funding for holiday payments, although that was then turned around, the kind of continuous uncertainty for the voluntary and community sector, the barriers that people are facing everyday life. I do a lot of work with asylum seekers and refugees, some of the most marginalized people in our communities, and constantly trying to fight for reform of childcare. It was one of the main reasons why I ran for election. There are all these issues that are affecting people's lives, and as politicians, our toolbox is empty. There are only so many letters you can write to permanent secretaries asking that they do something, knowing that the budget is in dire straits and there's not really anything you can do. But there is something you can do, and Alliance has been very vocal on the need for reform. And we see reform in a number of key areas. The first is really, the immediate changes would be the nominating of the First and Deputy First Minister, amending the 98 Act to permit entitlement to pass to the next party. we agree that de Hunt is a good way of doing it and that it should be based on the largest parties. But if you don't want to do the work, then it should pass to someone who does want to do the work. This constant start is just devastating for the whole society. It's constantly hanging over your head, this worry that everything is going to collapse again. And it's not sustainable and it's not fair to people in Northern Ireland. The cross-community votes, I've already said, Alliance went from 7 MLAs to 17 MLAs. Former party leader John is here today, and it's incredible the growth of Alliance as a cross-community middle ground party. But our cross-community votes don't count in a cross-community vote. That's mad. So we would change that. We would want to change the petitions of concern so that they're restricted to very key areas, so that they're not used for things like high hedges legislation and things they were never intended for. And in terms of executive functioning, we proposed that we'd realign the trigger of cross-community votes to those kind of key areas of national identity and security. And we've written a long paper on reforms and how we would see that implemented. The general consensus from the Irish government, the British government, from other parties, and as Doug has just said, is that we have to wait until the Assembly is up and running and then negotiate and get it across the line. And I understand that, and I appreciate that it's something that people are nervous about, tinkering with the Good Friday Agreement. But what is worse? Every month we're spending more and more money. The institutions are not working. Departments are getting to a state where I don't know how they get back from it. If we were to reform right now, especially around the cross-community vote, we could get a speaker up and running tomorrow. We could have an assembly up and running tomorrow. The DUP don't want to be in government. Pass it over to us. We're ready and waiting. So there are things that can be done, and I think they should be done, because I don't think we can continue with this. I don't know what's going to happen when the DUP are going to come back in. I am hopeful because I think that there is no other option. Devolution matters. Local ministers making decisions for local people matters. And it's incredibly important that the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement are protected and enhanced. And the final thing I would say is I completely agree with Doug. Everyone is very good at coming in and celebrating the milestones and saying how wonderful it is and showing the Good Friday Agreement up as this kind of beacon, and it is. But you can't just come in for the milestones. You need to be invested in it the whole time. And when the Assembly is up and running, we're going to need to continue to have that support.
Thank you. And finally, Claire Hanna.
Thank you very much for having us and for organising it. That's the danger of going first, as well as the things we were asked to address. About 57 wee things scribbled down. Well, obviously, in the context of the alternatives, the agreement has been overwhelmingly positive, but I think on the 25th anniversary stuff made this very clear. The absence of conflict is no longer ambitious enough for people, and it's no longer enough of a goal, particularly for young people. And there have been, poor Emma, every time anyone the representative of all young people in Northern Ireland there, but we have also failed quite substantially on legacy issues, and perhaps we'll pick that up. The bill that's going through Parliament at the moment is meets the needs of perpetrators and not victims. But alongside that, we've also made very little progress on truth and justice and symbols, and by that I mean flags, and I mean street-based paraphernalia, and all that feeding into narratives. Because I think a lot of us in '98 thought, that it was about saying that was awful, let's make sure it never happens again. And I think the further we get from the conflict, there's more of, what they did was awful, they better never do that again, rather than a wider narrative about what went wrong. And I think that is a bit of a time bomb under the process in the decades that we have ahead. We've made very little progress on reconciliation, on North-South actually, and then on the opportunities of kind of harnessing public services and the potential of the all-island economy, and just generally the meaningful changes in people's lives that politics is supposed to be about in terms of public services and economic well-being. And we're in a very different place in terms of the economy, but a lot of that is almost in spite of what we've done via Stormont. The agreement is definitely still relevant. I like to say it's not an ornament, it's a toolkit, and there is a danger that we spend this anniversary period going, look at that thing that we did in 1998, and we lose the relevance to it as a framework to meet all of the big existential challenges, things like Brexit and like constitutional change, but just the everyday on things like environmental management, and as I say, on the economy, and some of the areas for cooperation defined in the agreement weren't ever meant to be exhaustive. And I know through the Brexit period we tried to broaden those out. Brexit, of course, has changed things profoundly, and you knew that. It has really all the stuff that the agreement was supposed to soften around identity and sovereignty and borders and all that. Brexit sharpened it all up, and it has had an impact absolutely on people's perceptions of the agreement. There are some elements within political unionism, particularly on the far right, and Northern Ireland has a far right, and we need to sort of acknowledge that, but have been only too keen to sort of throw the Good Friday baby out with the protocol bathwater, and some of the assault on solutions like the protocol and the Windsor framework, I think have been about unpicking some of the cooperative principles in the agreement, and I'm willing to admit, absolutely, even those of us who are on the pro-agreement and kind of pro-softer solutions to Brexit side, sometimes the agreement has been, overly utilized, bashed over the head, and you're being mean to the agreement. And I always think of in Only Fools and Horses, anytime Del Boy wanted Rodney to do something, he'd go, Rodney, on her deathbed, our mother said, and he'd say what he wanted to say, and everybody does that with the agreement. The point they want to make, they use the agreement as the entry point, and if you don't do this, you're being bad to the agreement. And there's a largely a la carte approach, across the board, people picking the bits that they like and maybe disrespecting other part of it. So Brexit has changed things. It has absolutely accelerated the conversation on constitutional change and put a dynamic in there that wasn't there. But ultimately, that is still about uniting people, and Brexit hasn't done that. So it's not the kind of, it's a bit scorched earth in terms of how you have that conversation. But we're having that conversation. In terms of, we were asked to say, how your party has kind of stood by the agreement. I think the SDLP has done that in thick and thin, and I genuinely think by instinct, and perhaps sometimes a little bit too much at times. It hasn't been the most politically lucrative. I think people want to see politicians ducking and diving a wee bit more than being pure to the agreement. And I think, again, particularly for younger people, there is a sense that it was a project of 25 years. We stopped trying to sell us the same thing over and over again, but we have always championed maximum implementation, and including things like the Bill of Rights and some of the civic forum concepts that I think could have kept the process functioning a little bit better if they had been honoured. And I'm very much open to emerging initiatives like opposition, and I think that was a positive thing that we did in 2016, and hopefully it will be again. And some of the stuff around wider participation and civic forums and all that kind of stuff. In terms of delivering your politics as a social democrat, it's difficult to do that in the assembly, particularly when it's up and down and without all of the economic levers. And I think there is a bit of a loss, I suppose, in terms of pluralism and just keeping a wide number of voices. I think we're narrowing the number of voices that are in the conversation, and there's a bit of a rush to kind of clear the ground to maybe 2 or 3 blocks, the kind of, United Ireland, come what may, Union, come what may, and sort of let's not talk about it. And I think 25 years ago we did have a wider set of voices, and that was for the good. And in terms of the future, reform, absolutely, and that's, as we know, provided for in the agreement. And quite simply, the operation as we have it now isn't working. I mean, those are issues of attitude and behaviour rather than completely of standing orders, and it could be made to work, but it isn't doing, and we've certainly put down amendments through MEPOC and other bills to try and address things like the election of First Ministers, things like removing the veto or for the election of Speaker. But there's wider reforms that that can basically incentivise compromise a little bit more, because unfortunately the vetoes are like a gun on the table. If they're there, and they have been used and they will be used, and even if the parties try not to use them, the two large parties have used them in the recent past, because they're there, people will goad them into using them. So we need to design them out, and I hope de-emphasise, if not remove, designation, which is sort of making sheep and goat out of people whenever they go in, and probably overemphasising some of those differences and locking in divisions. So how we do that is becoming more complicated. Again, there is, as Kate said, a sense that we can't do it until we get back into the Assembly, and hopefully we'll be there in August or in autumn. We resisted too much of a push on reform, particularly under the Johnson and Truss government, because we were terrified about what they would do if parties like ours said, that there needs to be reform to the agreement, and we would say it's keyhole surgery rather than kind of hacking at it in the way that might have happened. But undoubtedly that's a conversation we have to move into.
Great. Well, thanks to all the speakers for more or less keeping to time, which gives us a decent window for discussion. What I thought I'd do, rather than ask you all to comment on each other, is to raise some issues which were perhaps particularly emphasised by one speaker, but which touches on some core aspect of the 1998 agreement and its prospects going forward. So coming back to a point really that was emphasised by Kate. So if I could begin with you, Kate, and then Conor, Doug, and Claire in that order could comment on it. So, I mean, the Good Friday Agreement, as has already been mentioned at the first panel, had many dimensions: power sharing, consent, the parity issue, rights, policing, north-south relations. But clearly a central element was the structure around power sharing. And what was envisaged was a power sharing arrangement between two parties. The UUP and the SDLP, with others contributing from the wings. So my question is, and this, I'm beginning with you, you've already addressed this, but it'll be interesting, I suppose, more to hear what the other parties have to say. What difference has the rise of alliance made? And it has, as you say, been a meteoric rise, and it's been emphasised less in the press, both in the Republic of Ireland and in Britain. So that the meteoric rise of the alliance, what difference has it made to really just the appropriateness of the agreement and the way that it's structured? You've suggested changing it would be tinkering. Actually, I think it would be a total overhaul. But anyway, beginning with you, could you sort of recapitulate your point, and then we'll see what the other speakers have to say?
Yeah, I'm very interested in what everyone else has to say about reform as well. I think certainly, I mean, this is something that a number of parties have been talking about. It was in the DUP manifesto about changing that, in 2016, specifically around cross-community votes. So we were 7 MLAs, we're 17 now. Our voices are louder, and that certainly has put it on the platforms more. It was never, the Good Friday Agreement is incredible, but it was always intended to be kind of something that you could use, as Claire said, as a toolkit. And society has changed. We're changing. We're all minorities now, and that needs to be reflected. I'll pass on to everyone else, because I think I made my point pretty clearly. If cross-community votes don't count in a cross-community vote, that's not fair. That needs to change. It needs to reflect that. And I suppose one other thing I'll just say quickly is that when we talk about designation, sometimes I think people who designate as unionist or nationalist find it a bit offensive, and they think that we come across as a bit smug and that we're better than them because we're above it all. That's not the case. I respect deeply that people who are nationalists see it as United Ireland as a means of dealing with policy issues, and the same for people who are unionists. But our view is that we are always going to have to share this place. We're always going to have to share it. And so our focus as a cross-community party with members who have views on a range, some people are Irish, some people are British, some people are both, some people don't care. Our focus is on how we build a shared future now. And so we resent being designated as other to nationalists and unionists. We're a united community.
Thank you. Conor.
Well, just a couple of points. I was actually struck with I was at quite a lot of the events, the Good Friday Agreement 25th anniversary events, about how one of the themes that some of the people who were considered architects of the agreement returned to was a caution around whole-scale change to the Good Friday Agreement. But the reality is it's not the Ten Commandments, it wasn't carved into stone, and we have had a continuous process, and unfortunately for my sins I've been involved in most of them, a continuous process of review and change over the last 25 years. And so there should. The Good Friday Agreement was set in a particular period of time. That time has changed, time has moved on. Huge amount of change in politics, not just in terms of a growing other, not to insult Kate, but a growing alliance vote and instead of the two blocks that were originally envisaged in the power sharing arrangement. So, of course, there is an opportunity to look at that. We have to ensure that we protect the principles of the Good Friday Agreement, because power sharing, it isn't mandatory. It's people are entitled as of right to be in an executive. They're not obliged to be in an executive. So there is a difference between that. It's not mandatory. You're not forced to go into the executive against your wishes. So the device and all of the parties, with the exception of Alliance, have left the institutional arrangements at some stage or another in protest or in order to achieve something. So everybody has used this particular device at some stage or other. But I do believe that we've got to a stage where that is becoming corrosive in terms of faith in politics and the ability to actually do things in a situation where we have huge amount of challenges, not least in terms of our public services and the pressure they're under, that we can't get doing work on. And I echo Kate's view in terms of frustration of all of that. So I would say yes, absolutely. Let's continue to look at that. It's not a chicken and egg thing. We are up for the process of discussion on reform, but we also recognise that there are important principles in terms of the historic experience of the state, the principles of power sharing and how they would be protected and how communities would be protected. There's a recognition now that there's a community that perhaps didn't get the protection in terms of the original Good Friday Agreement, and we're very much up for looking at how that can be achieved.
Great, thank you so much. Doug.
Yeah, thank you. I think review is a good thing. Change is a good thing. Collective decision making is a good thing. And I think that's what we need. What we cannot have is people deciding for us behind a closed door and then coming out with a deal that actually in the long term is just to benefit one side or the other side. So I think whatever we decide to do, we have to be very careful. We have to be careful because the Belfast Good Friday Agreement was voted on by a referendum by the people, and every time we change that, we're changing away from what they voted on. That's not saying we shouldn't change. I'm just saying we have to be very mindful about what we do. There's ways that you can look at change. I think power sharing is still really important and is still at the heart of what we have in Northern Ireland. Is how do you manage that power sharing? Is that power sharing best done with up to 5 political parties and 1 executive? I'm not sure it necessarily is. Before the collapse of Stormont at the end of 2016, Sinn Féin and the DUP were in the executive on their own together, and the rest of us had all slipped into opposition. Actually, well, that was starting to take shape as something that could work and was going to be really, really good. But then Stormont collapsed, and we never got to see how that was going to develop. But it's a way that we could look to see how we could do that. Power sharing in the executive between the 2 largest parties and making provisions for those who are not aligned to be in that if they so wished. And then power sharing in opposition with those who are not aligned, having provisions made for them specific, for them to go into opposition if they so wish. That's something you can do, but what you can't do is make it up yourselves. You have to sit down, you have to be transparent, you have to talk about the negotiations. What you cannot do, and what the Secretary of State seems to think is a good idea to do, is do all the negotiating behind closed door and then bounce it on you and say this is the deal that we're going to do. It doesn't work that way. People won't accept that. And that's why some of the other deals that we've been thrown at us over the years simply hasn't worked, and the last one being the New Decade New Approach, and I explained how that came about. We didn't see the document, it was just slapped on in front of us, and that was the deal that was done. So I guess the point that I'm making is whatever changes that we decide to make, and everybody will have great ideas, but it's not about good ideas, it's about what will work in the long term to make Northern Ireland work for its people, to make it prosperous. and be part of, for me, a renewed and invigorated United Kingdom. Because we're all unionists in some shape or form. All of you are unionists in some shape or form. Even this table's all unionist in some shape or form. Because if you believe in the European Union, it's a union of countries. If you believe in the United States, it's a union of states. Conor wants a united Ireland. That's a union of the two. It doesn't matter which way you look at it. But the bottom line is, what we need to do is make people united in making a place work. And we can only do that if we're transparent in the transactions that we do and let the people know what we're doing and don't just bounce it on them at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of that, particularly as Doug was saying, that it needs to have buy-in. The agreement was, widely negotiated and endorsed by the people, and stuff like St Andrews were done over the heads of nearly everybody and all of the electorate. I'll just take you on one thing. The agreement wasn't about a partnership between two parties. It was about a framework for reconciling two great traditions, and I suppose that still, I think, what the dynamic that we're seeing...
Two parties were envisaged as the vehicle.
No, I think it provided for parties. It was about balancing competing needs. I'm happy to stand over that. But I think what we're seeing is identity diffusing a little bit. People who may still have views but don't want to focus excessively on it. But the fact is that sovereignty issue is still, and is probably more so than it's been before, going to be a dynamic in our politics. And it's a bit like, you can say, well, I don't see race, I'm anti-racist. It doesn't mean that racial divisions don't exist, and there doesn't need to be some sort of a framework for managing it. I think it's really important, particularly those of us who do identify as nationalists aren't seen to be kicking the ladder. Basically, those minority protections were for nationalism, but now we don't need them. They don't need to be there anymore, particularly with the anxieties many in unionism are feeling. And I really appreciate what Kate was saying, and I genuinely think she gets and believes that. I think I do feel more so by the Alliance sometimes than anybody else put in a box politically, and I know that she I think there is an evolution in everybody's politics. Sometimes the other designation is used a little bit like a pioneer pin, the pioneers in your life, to remind me of my virtue and you of your sin, about the having of views. It's perfectly honourable to believe in the Union. It's perfectly honourable to believe in a New Ireland. It's perfectly honourable to have no opinion. And I think the interesting thing is that younger people just don't really identify with the nation state, maybe in the way a lot of us around this table would. They would more likely identify as feminist or LGBT or environmentalist or whatever, and it's how we manage all of those. How we unpick that is another thing. I've been thinking about this for years. How, for example, if you take away designation, there are ways that you can get to consensus around things like qualified majority voting, and as I say, I've tabled amendments in the last few years that sort of sketch out how you do that. But for example, what do you do around a first and deputy first minister? Do you not have the deputy anymore, and are you putting all your eggs in one basket? So it's a case of how the devil is going to be in the detail in a lot of those things. But you definitely do want to dial it down. I was elected 3 times, and I went in each time and said Social Democrat, nationalist, but only the nationalist part is recorded, and perhaps we broaden out the different ways that people can identify their politics. In terms of the cross-community vote, in fact, the electorate largely dealt with that. I don't believe there were any cross-community votes in the last mandate. Am I wrong on that? The MLAs might be able to tell me. So it's less acute an issue than it was because no party hits the threshold on their own. So it's probably not the defining governance issue for me, but I understand that symbolically it is.
Within the executive, though.
Well, exactly. There's the St Andrews veto within the executive, which isn't part of the original agreement and isn't helpful either.
Okay, well, I'd like to raise another issue. A lot of people mentioned how Brexit had been a spanner in the works insofar as it raised again, I suppose the issue of the border and therefore the relationship between jurisdictions. But within the agreement, as everyone knows, there is in turn a destabilizing principle, which is to say that by plebiscite, the agreement can be voted out of existence and Northern Ireland obliged to join another territory without necessarily a power sharing mechanism envisaged for it. So my question is really, people also mentioned that there'd been a sort of deliverance in 1998 and the levels of improvement ever since. But of course, after 1920, if you'd have asked in 1960 what the future looked like, 1968 wasn't envisaged. So the question is really, is there much hope for a settlement at all, which was designed in some sense to expire? Now there will be different interpretations of whether it's designed to expire, but George Mitchell thought it was. I mean, he thought in the end it was a mistake that unionists had made in signing up to an agreement whereby they could be voted into a new territory. You know, it could be designed to expire at an unspecified future. So is this itself the underlying pressure in relation to which Brexit is just an illustration of it, essentially? If we could begin with you, Claire.
Yeah, I maybe interpret it a different way, not want to contradict George Mitchell. I don't think it does. I don't think there's any sunset clause on the agreement. I think in theory it continues.
No, it's anticipation of the future, so that's his anticipation.
There isn't a kind of a reversal mechanism, I suppose, once the principle of consent is triggered one time. I suppose that's, and I don't know even if having that in there would in reality mean anything, but that's what I was getting at when I said about the framework. It's about ultimately relationships, and it's about basically a way to manage the internal relationships within the region. And I have to say, from the SDLP's perspective, Northern Ireland will continue to exist. I think there's a perception that, you know, the northernness disappears in a New Ireland, and it doesn't. And I used to get called partitionist for saying that. And I respond by saying, have you ever visited Cork? Have you ever met anybody from Cork? They're proud of their regional identity, and I think it's perfectly rational for those of us who are, you know, of the north, who believe in New Ireland, to be so. But I think the fact is there's no switch that flips and all these civil servants run in and run Northern Ireland. There will inevitably be a different dimension there for a while, but the agreement provides, as I say, the toolkit and the framework and the way to enhance as well things like Strand 3 to give some comfort to unionism, but also just to address the reality that we have entwined lives and, you know, hundreds of thousands of people living in a different part of the islands from whence they came. That's all that we have to explore in a very serious way. And things like the Brendan O'Leary book, I think, of even those of us who've aspired to this for years, it has just opened, I think, a lot of people's minds to all of the different things we need to explore. But I don't think it does. I don't think it does dissolve. Whether or not it's desirable to maintain devolution, for what it's worth, I don't think it is, because for all the reasons that it's not working, I don't think. But it doesn't. That would have to be negotiated and put away in the years to come.
I think we know what you think, Conor, but quickly.
Well, I mean, the Northern State wasn't designed to last from its conception. It wasn't intended to be a permanent arrangement. And of course, the constitutional question has always been there since partition happened. So there is a device in the Good Friday Agreement to allow us to address that in a peaceful and a democratic way, which is clearly a better position than we were in prior to 1998. And so, you know, I mean, there is this question of it's a green and orange thing. I think we are beyond all of that. I mean, the type of Ireland that I want to see is not nationalist, Gaelic, Catholic Ireland. I want to see a pluralist, progressive, rights-based society, which, you know, slowly but surely the north is becoming, but by great strides the south has become over time, one which is at peace with itself, which is prosperous for all of its people, which protects rights and identity. So it's not the idea of a green Ireland versus an orange state in the north. And I think we are beyond that. The question is, what is in our best interests as a people that live on the island and share the island together? Is it hitched to changing Westminster governments, Tories, which take off in their own crazy direction in terms of their policies, or is it actually deciding our own future and our relationships between the two islands and the ongoing adherence and respect and attachment to royalty and to the idea of Britishness? Can we craft something which reflects that, but gives us a control within the European framework, as it would be, of our own destiny in terms of deciding what's in the best interest? It's not about imposition of a kind of nationalist Ireland on top of a unionist people. That's long gone. I think we're in a situation now where we want to create a pluralist island which is, as I say, prosperous, at peace with itself, outward-looking, democratic, progressive, and one which is based on social and economic justice would be our particular, I suppose, interest in all of that. So it's, this kind of thing about this is all green and orange politics, and this isn't where young people are at. Young people are thinking what's in their best interest, what's their best future. And I think that's the type of state that they want. That's the type of state that I want to belong to as well, and one which protects rights and identities of everybody who lives in it, whether it be British, new nationals with all of the ethnic mix and diversity and benefits that is bringing to our island as well, or whatever, whether they've no identity or religion or anything else. I think that's the debate that we're in, and what is in our best interest. And increasingly, people have all acknowledged that Brexit is a catalyst for that, only insofar as it shows you what a government in Britain, if it takes a mad notion, can do to our future when we have no control. We voted to remain. We were taken out against our wishes. It didn't matter what our democratic view was, and that included unionists as well as people from the nationalists and people from, I'm very loath to say other, in case Kate hits me a whack on the side of the head. But
it's not your fault. You can come up with a term.
People from right across the political spectrum voted to remain. So I think it has advanced that discussion insofar as people have said how fragile our democracy is, because we can have decisions taken in London which deeply impact on all of us, including their austerity policies, which are deeply impacting on us now, and we have no control over any of that. And I think people increasingly look at a new society they want to create, and it isn't an orange and green issue, it's what's in the best interest of the people who live on the island.
Doug?
Yeah, I don't get sometimes. I don't get this orange and green stuff and how people explain it. To be perfectly honest, I think it's far more complicated than that. I'm fiercely Irish. I have been fiercely Irish my whole life. I identify as Irish, and I'm proud to be able to say that. There's many things right across the island that represent me, and I accept every single one of them because that's the identity I have. Of course, I'm British as well. I've lived in England, Scotland, Wales, and in Northern Ireland. And when I lived in England, I felt uniquely Irish, but British. In Wales, uniquely Irish, but British. In England, uniquely Irish, but British. So I am British. How does that fit in? I have what I want. I have what I want. The United Kingdom is going through a really difficult time.
But you could lose it. That's the.
Well, I could lose it. It's the United Kingdom. It's self-harm. The United Kingdom has self-harmed itself with Brexit, and they are in a really bad place. The Conservative government have not been good. That's a fact. I don't think anybody can stand over and say they have been good. They have been really poor, and they have dragged us down, and they've dragged the people down. But that's not a reason for people to say, I'm jumping ship. When Ireland was going through a difficult time in the noughties, did we expect all Republicans to suddenly say, I'm not a Republican anymore, I want to be a unionist because the United Kingdom's doing quite well? Doesn't make sense. And the point that you raised about George Mitchell saying, well, who would sign an agreement where you're going to allow people to vote you out of the union that you want to be part of? I actually look at it in a different way, because before the agreement, the UK government could have done whatever they wanted without a vote. They could have literally says, we don't want you anymore, away you go.
In principle, they didn't feel they could in practice.
Well, they could have, and many unionists will be sitting saying, thank goodness Corbyn didn't get him to become the Prime Minister, because we may well be ending up in that, we would end up in that direction. I'm not sure if that was the case or not, but that's what they think. But I think what we have now is the ability for the people of Northern Ireland to decide. Where unionists have failed is they haven't understood that you need to make the place which is Northern Ireland work so people want it to continue. That's what we have to do. And as boring as it sounds, that means concentrating on things like the economy, because the economy will drive our NHS, the economy will create houses, the economy will create jobs for our young people to wake in the morning with a sense of purpose and go to bed with a sense of fulfilment. So we have to focus on the economy to make Northern Ireland work. So I think we gained from the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Yes, 50+1 is the principle, and if it's a 50+1 on a border poll, we become a united Ireland. But I don't think that's good for anybody. I think we've seen with Brexit that would be a bad deal, and I don't think anybody wants to work on that principle, although that's what the principle is, and I'm a Democrat and I would certainly work to that principle. But I think we have gained so much. But I think identity now in Northern Ireland is far more multi-layered than people realise. And that's why I don't look at anything anymore through a religious lens or through an orange and green lens. I simply don't. And I think, you know, people are deciding their own way, and even some people are cultural nationalists, but actually would vote to stay in the United Kingdom. That's just the nature of people.
Great. And finally, Kate, 2 minutes.
Yeah, don't have a huge amount to add to that. Brexit was an absolute disaster, and from an Alliance Party perspective, it was interesting because we'd never really had conversations internally about the constitutional position. You know, like obviously people would have their own preferences and their own maybe long-term aspirations, but people I would never expect to have conversations about what the future could look like started to have it. It's loaded though. When I was mayor, I was telling someone this recently, I did an interview with someone and they asked me my view on drugs policy. And I said, oh, well, I think we should decriminalise it. Criminal justice is not part of it. And then afterwards I felt sick and I thought, Naomi is going to kill me. Is this the right policy? Did I say the right thing? I was panicking for a week after on the phone to the press office. In the same interview, I had also said that I recognised that nationalists were having a conversation about what a new progressive United Ireland would look like. And I thought it was a shame that progressive unionists weren't having the same opportunity, same discussions around what a progressive Northern Ireland as part of the UK should look like. And that dominated the headlines. It wasn't that I thought that drugs should be decriminalised, it was that I thought that unionists should have more conversations about what a progressive Northern Ireland in the UK should look like. And it is so loaded, and it's very difficult to have these conversations, but we need to have more of them. You know, young people are seeing very little hope. They're either leaving because that's where they can kind of reach their ambitions, or they don't feel much kind of faith in their political institutions. I have a 3-year-old. I'm terrified he's going to move to Australia. I want him to grow up being proud that his father is from Féin and to play Gaelic, but to also recognise that we're a really multi-leveled society. I want him to go to a good integrated school. We don't have enough of those. There are so many things within our society that we need to fix, and we're all so many different things. We're not just a politician or just a parent. We're all these different things, and it needs to be protected. But the genius of the Good Friday Agreement was that you could be British, Irish, or both. And Brexit made that very difficult because it put it back on the map again.
There's no future in playing Gaelic for Fermanagh.
I know.
Deviation. Well, I think we've had 4 excellent contributions from our speakers and also a very productive and open-minded discussion. So at this point, I think we should put our hands together and thank them all and hand over to the next panel.